As we look forward to the end of what I believe to be the tragic and failed George Bush presidency, I plan to devote some interviews to exploring new directions and new policies in different areas now through the election and perhaps through January as well. Today, I will look at security strategy and planning with Thomas Barnett, an expert on how globalization is transforming warfare, whom U.S. News and World Report calls one of the most important strategic thinkers of our time. And next Tuesday, my guest will be Andrew Bacevich, author of The Limits of Power, The End of American Exceptionalism. I believe some of the key issues and questions in this arena of national security, foreign policy, defense, war, etc. are, and I'm just going to lay a few of them out here now, and then I will bring Thomas in to get more specific about his thinking and have a conversation in pursuit of some greater understanding. Some of the things, the issues and questions that I think are, is the United States actually the sole superpower? And if so, what does that actually mean? There's a lot of books and writing nowadays about that question. Is the United States pursuing empire, whether intentionally, whether obviously or not? And what are the costs of imperial adventures? Another, how should national security be properly defined and pursued at this point in time and at this stage in the globe and globalization? What actual threats do we face, and how should they be prioritized? How do we challenge what I believe is a strategy-free consensus of McCain, Obama, and most mainstream political figures and experts that we need to sustain or increase present levels of military spending? What realities are obscured by the flawed notion of a global war on terror? How can we best isolate the worst terrorists as pariahs in their own societies? On what principles should our relationships with the rest of the world be based? What are our actual security resources and assets? And how can they most wisely be employed? What are the wisest and most necessary security investments we should be making? And finally, and this is what I'm hoping to begin today, what would an honest, realistic, and wise discussion of security choices, priorities, and options look like? Thomas Barnett has been a senior advisor to military and civilian leaders in a range of offices, including the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Staff, Central Command, and Special Operations Command. From November 2001 to June 2003, a very critical period, he advised the Pentagon on transforming military capabilities to meet future threats. He also led the 5-year New Rule Set project on how globalization is transforming warfare. In his book, The Pentagon's New Map, War and Peace in the 21st Century, Barnett presents concrete, world-changing strategies for transforming the U.S. military, which he believes is adrift in the aftermath of the Cold War and 9/11, into a two-tiered power, capable not just of winning battles, but of promoting and preserving international peace. Barnett is currently the Senior Managing Director of Entura Solutions, a contributing editor for Esquire magazine, a distinguished scholar and author for the Howard Baker Jr. Center for Public Policy at the University of Tennessee. He's also a frequent and intensely followed blogger. He is author of The Pentagon's New Map, War and Peace in the 21st Century, and Blueprint for Action, A Future Worth Creating. I like listeners to get to know a bit about the people, Thomas, behind the ideas and the work. So briefly, what was your path to the work that you're doing today?
I'm a political scientist by background. I got a PhD at Harvard. At the end of the Cold War, I was a Soviet studies major, so I wrote about Soviet bloc relationships with third world client states, for example. And it's interesting to know a lot of the people who become globalization experts come from that kind of Soviet-U.S. superpower rivalry background, because if you think back to the 1980s, that was the closest venue you had, intellectually speaking, to kind of think about the world and how it worked. I went from that PhD down to Washington, worked for a RAND-like institution that works primarily for the Navy and the Marine Corps called the Center for Naval Analyses. Did about 8 years there, then went to the Naval War College, where I did a long study on Y2K, which was the eye-opener, because it was really positing the notion that Well, it asked the question, what would an attack on globalization and all its networks look and feel like? And we came up with some very intricate scenarios about Y2K that all proved to be false because Y2K was a scheduled exercise, thank God. But were highly descriptive of the days surrounding 9/11, which was interesting. Not that we were predicting that.
Right. But so in other words, what you're saying is, although it turned out that was a fear that didn't come to pass, the intense study of it, of what it would mean and how it would happen and so on, has actually been very helpful.
It said this is what a shock to a system, a global system, a highly networked, horizontally networked system would play out, right down to the point where we predicted fellow travelers who would take advantage of the ensuing chaos to seed their own bits of destruction, which, kind of foresaw the possibility of something like the anthrax situation as a fellow traveler, somebody taking advantage. And all sorts of islanding and, meaning shutting down of networks and hoarding of stuff in the aftermath, and the notion that there would be actors who would take advantage within their own systems to crack down on the undesirables. So, for example, the Chinese in their western provinces, and in some ways, Putin's behavior ever since. I went from the Y2K work to a series of workshops I did atop the World Trade Center with a firm called Cantor Fitzgerald, the ones who lost so many people on 9/11. And that, ironically enough, was looking at the future of globalization and asking questions about Asia's energy use, its foreign direct investment, its environment, and food and water shortages arising therefrom. It was an amazingly predictive series of workshops, which I don't take that much credit for, because it was really reliant upon the way Wall Street, and in specific how Cantor Fitzgerald was looking ahead to the future of the world. It really opened my eyes to something that's been a mainstay of my thinking ever since, which is how I kind of obliquely deal or deflect a lot of the questions that get asked, like your series at the beginning, when they're so focused on the political military reality of how the world works. You often miss the underlying economic reality, which I would argue is more like 70, 75, 80% of the reality out there. And it really behooves us to give kind of a deep study to these tremendous transformations coming about because of globalization's rapid spread around the planet.
Yeah, let me cut in there, Tom, just to say, not in terms of defending myself, but I think actually underlying a lot of those questions is an agreement with what you're saying. In other words, when I say, how should national security be properly defined and pursued? Right. What actual threats do we face? I'm not buying into, and what's obscured by the notion of global war and terror, et cetera, I'm not buying into the glasses of looking through the world through a military perspective. I'm actually questioning those premises the same way you do.
Right, but you're going to hear that from Basevich and others who have a tendency to define empire and our use of power sort of in what I call war within the context of war viewpoint, when you really need to view war within the context of everything else to understand why it occurs and under what conditions it can be successfully concluded. So we're trapped with a lot of the language, is my point, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Can you briefly tell us kind of brief definitions of some of your big ideas, and by those I would say the use of the term rule sets, and then the use of the terms the core and the gap?
Yeah, I drew a map of the world based on where we sent U.S. forces since the end of the Cold War. It's about 150 times. If you imagine a map from left to right, the interventions, as we call them, are clustered in the Caribbean below Mexico, in the Andean portion of South America. They encompass virtually all of Africa. In the 90s, they encompass the Balkans, the Caucasus, Southwest Asia, otherwise known as the Middle East or the Persian Gulf, Central Asia, and the littoral of Southeast Asia. And if you imagine that swath from left to right, it's a very equatorial-centric chunk of the world. Now, what I asked when I plotted those various military interventions is, what is it about those regions that tends to attract U.S. military power time and time again? And what I came up with was, these are the regions that are most thinly or least connected to the global economy. Why that matters is this. The more you connect up to the outside world, the more you're subject to the larger world's rules for that connectivity, how you interact in terms of money or trade or immigration. So the more you connect, the more you're subject to code, is my phrase. And what we find is the more connectivity between a country and the outside world, dense connectivity, the lower the likelihood of there being instability or violence. So this map, I distinguish between that chunk in the middle I call the non-integrating gap, and the chunk on the outside I call the functioning core of globalization.
So in other words, let me just clarify.
Sure.
You drew it originally by asking the question by looking at interventions. And then it turns out, of course, there are places within that swath where there have not been interventions, but you began to see the patterns in where the potential for disruptions were.
Right. And it's a simple concept. It's not very different from Immanuel Kant's original concept that, democracies tend to go to war less with each other. Well, democracies tend to be with more advanced economies. Advanced economies tend to have more connections with their neighbors in the outside world. So there's an underlying pacifying aspect of this that's driven by globalization, which I like to call really the progeny of the United States, because it really comes about as a result of the international liberal trade order that we set in motion after the Second World War that replaces Eurasia's colonialization scheme and really begets first the West and now what we call the global economy or globalization. So that spread of globalization embodied deeply in that core where there is no war, and then not yet deeply connected to those parts of the world, about 1/3 of humanity in terms of population, but only 10% of the global GDP that I call the gap. And so the question became, how do you shrink that gap? It's not enough to contain it and maybe bad things coming out of it. You want to shrink it because it's not like the old Soviet Union where you wait them out. These are places that are in bad straits already. And if you think, for example, about global warming, well, these are the places that can't feed themselves now and aren't going to be able to grow food very easily in the future as we warm up.
Right.
So I make the argument on top of that you really need kind of two different forces to deal.
Before we go to that, let me just ask a quick question. So it begins with this area that is both economically, demographically, and so on defined, but also geographically. But it seems to me that most of Africa is in the gap, though it doesn't fit into that place geographically. So once you came up with it, then core and gap are not so much linked to geography as they are to this question of connectedness or not, correct?
Well, it's connectedness, but there's a critical mass argument. Okay? Regions tend to become pacified and deeply embedded within globalization en masse. If you build a mansion in the ghetto, it doesn't turn it into the suburbs. There needs to be kind of a larger process, not just your house, but the gentrification of neighborhoods and the revitalization of neighborhoods and the growing economic vitality of a community. So, when I talk about shrinking the gap, I say it's not a matter of saying, hey, Israel's very connected, but it's found inside your gap. Sure it is, but Israel isn't a bad neighborhood. And the only way Israel can be considered safe, meaning really off the table in terms of state-on-state war, is for the Middle East to become integrated in a larger fashion in the global economy. So there is a strong geographic element to it.
Okay, in that way, I see what you're saying. Now, Africa, as I said, much of it falls outside of that geographic swath, but certainly is it seems to me, as disconnected as anywhere.
I define Africa as almost overwhelmingly gap.
Of course, right.
Right.
Okay, and so then you're saying that one of your intentions is that, or one of your guiding principles would be that it is in our interests and in the world's interests to bring people into the connected core.
I'd make an almost more deterministic argument than that. And you'll see this in the second book and even more so in the third book I just finished. It's coming out in February. I make the argument that, again, globalization, very much our progeny. We're the world's oldest and most successful multinational political, economic, security union. Our version of globalization has been projected upon the planet without attendant political control, but with a bodyguarding role for our U.S. military. So not the classic colonialization where we want to own your country, and yet we do put out the same kind of military effort that the Brits did to kind of keep the global playing field fair and even and open door, going all the way back to John Hay and Teddy Roosevelt. And in that sense, we have triggered an expansion of the global economy that's in the last 25 years especially. That's absolutely stunning, to the extent that this gap, as I would describe it, will get shrunk, whether we are there to play bodyguard or not, or to push the right kind of rules that need to happen, just because those 3 billion new capitalists in the East will demand it get shrunk. And there's a Chinese model to this. We saw a Russian model very recently, and there's kind of a passive integrationist European model. There's other slight models out there, but nothing compares to when there's real conflict and the Americans show up and make a real integration effort like we're doing in Iraq. So there's a bit of a competition, not unlike some people's minds the old colonial thing, but it's different.
Okay, let me just, so that, because globalization is a I'd say it's fraught with a lot of emotion and political meaning and so on. Where did the flaws in globalization, for instance, the local poor who along the way, due to corruption, greed, inequitable power distribution, and so on, the sustenance farmer who can no longer feed his family while his country moves into trade relations and becomes an export rather than a sustenance agriculture economy, where does that fit into what you're talking about?
Well, in most of these instances, we're talking about environments where there aren't sufficient rules to attract real money. I mean, the countries that have successfully joined globalization have typically attracted foreign direct investment in large numbers. That's what fuels the buildup of jobs in the urban centers that can accommodate the flow of people from rural agriculture who hopefully are freed up because they've mechanized and moved towards larger farms.
But what I'm saying is we're in, and I'm trusting that you sort of say, well, there are some costs along the way. There are people who get hurt along the way, but I mean, families, communities are end up much worse off along the way to what in the aggregate may look like an improved situation. You see what I'm saying? In other words, someone who pre-globalization was able to feed their family, perhaps when the country shifts to an export economy and he now shifts to...
And what I'm saying is those are typically situations not where there's too much globalization, but where there's too little, where you're getting some access to the global economy and you're getting certain players who control in an inequitable fashion the resources selling off, but that not trickling down to others because you're not attracting foreign direct investment who will come in and take advantage of your cheap labor, quote-unquote exploiting them. Average multinational, when it comes into these kinds of situations, will pay higher wages, significantly higher wages than the local economy can muster on its own. But you need enough rules in that environment to attract the right kind of companies under the right kind of conditions. And when that happens, it is still very tumultuous. I mean,
right. So you grant that people get hurt. People get hurt along the way, but I think you say several times in when I've read you say, I'm looking many years ahead, I'm looking globally.
Well, I'm looking over the last 25 years, too.
But I'm talking about the future.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, I mean, you've seen half the world living on $1 a day 25 years ago, and it's down to about 20% now.
Right.
That is stunning.
Yeah.
I mean, we've never seen poverty reduction like that. The parts that aren't taking advantage of that typically suffer a cluster of problems, one of the most important ones being security. And it's kind of, the bad neighborhood that nobody wants to go and put any factories or do any business with.
Right. Okay, so then we touched on another piece of what you're talking about, which is this whole thing about rules and rule sets.
Right.
And what you're saying is that it's a term taken from computers, from computer architecture, I believe, but basically what you're saying is that if you can bring people to actually play by certain rules, that then war and those sorts of, I believe you call them system perturbations, disruptions and so on, are less likely to happen.
Yes. Historically, they tend to go away. We haven't had great power on great power war across what I call the core, but we do have great powers in the core intervening under their own rule sets now and then inside my gap. And the United States has created, one could argue, and I think that's Bisevich's main argument, we've created a bad example in terms of how we've forged ahead with our unique rule set after 9/11, and didn't really get the buy-in we needed from the rest of the world, because we were purposely vague and unspecific about the conditions under which we would find it appropriate to go in and intervene in.
Let me jump to a big question. Do you believe that invading Afghanistan was the best response to the terrorist attack of 9/11?
I believe we had to oust the Taliban, and I believe ultimately we're going to have to deal with the Taliban more comprehensively.
Right. And do you believe that invading Iraq was wise?
I believe invading Iraq was inevitable, and I believe it's very hard for democracies to get their anger up enough to take care of problems endemic to the system like Iraq was for 20 or so years.
And let me just, because I really want to look at this as an example here. Do you believe it was legal? Do you believe it was moral?
I believe it was legal in the sense that we had 16 outstanding warrants from the UN Security Council.
But there were inspectors on the ground. We chased them out. It seems to me that the legality breaks down at that point. I mean, we defied the UN to support the UN.
Now, the UN is created for another era, unfortunately.
Right.
And it has a respect for state sovereignty that we find increasingly frustrating, because Saddam was a tremendously bad actor who created a lot of trouble in the region.
Right. Okay.
Killed his own people in large numbers. And when the global community, which has norms, says, hey, this guy's transgressed our norms 16 times by our count,
right,
then somebody has to go do something about it. What we lack is the sufficient rule set for kind of getting clear, not
but
just that decision.
Actually, you and I must agree that he did much of that bad stuff as a client state, or at least a temporary client state of ours. We were supportive of that. But let me ask a bigger question, because it's one that unsettles me about all of what you're saying, and that is, if I thought that the justifications for preemptive war, the justifications about WMD or violations of rules and so on actually mattered, I still would have been against it, because I don't think that the current leadership, or the leadership that took that on, I think that you have to set a very high standard if you're going to say that you are the nation that can take on preemptive war. And I don't think the leadership, and I don't just mean Bush, Rumsfeld, Cheney. If I look at the breakdown of our corporate world in Enron, our financial world with Bear Stearns, our accounting companies with Anderson, our regulation of financial people like Moody's, the fact that we funded the Iraq war for 5 years on emergency supplemental so that we don't have to really deal with it, I say we do not have the leaders to take on that role in this world. What do you say?
I would say we have some of the best leadership in the world on a regular basis, that we're a well-run country.
Well, wait, but why did our corporations be so beset by greed, and our accounting corporations were supposed to provide the accountability fail?
That's a separate argument. Capitalism goes through these cycles. We let them experiment. They create new things. They create very good things. They typically go overboard with them. We have a bit of a bust. We retool in terms of the rules. That's a continuing cycle that goes on decade upon decade upon decade.
But the moment at which you were holding out that we are the nation with the leadership capable of, let's say, changing the rules and saving the world, taking that, is the moment when we do not have the leadership in our corporate world. We do not have the leadership in our financial world. We do not have the leadership in our political world. And if we had leadership in our political world, at the very least, Iraq would no longer be emergency supplemental funded. It would be funded so that there would be actual choices that had to be made by the administration and by Congress. But I'm saying we're not showing the kind of leadership as a culture, as a people, that is in a position to tell the rest of the world how it should be done, and change the rules or set the rules for how that's going to happen. And you think that the cycles excuse that?
No, I made a separate argument on economics, which I think is superfluous to this one, to bring up corporate scandals with Enron. I don't think that has anything.
But I'm talking about our culture. In other words, it would be easy for me to say Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld are flawed leaders, but I'm saying it's not just them. There's something in our culture right now that we are not living up to the ideals in any sphere.
I don't know how Davos names us the most competitive economy in the world 3 years running. If that's true, I mean, I would cite a different view of our economic competitiveness and our corporate leadership than you have on that subject. My argument on Iraq is not that we waged the war badly. We waged the war very well, and it was a short war, and we were quite successful in it. What we have a problem doing is the post-war.
Exactly.
Because we weren't constructed for that kind of focus, because we all fell in love with the Powell Doctrine across the 1990s.
Exactly. I've got to let you go. What I want to recommend to people is this is provocative stuff. Your stuff about the core and the gap is very provocative. We have a difference at this point on whether we're in a position to be the ones that wage the preemptive wars. The website is thomaspmbarnett.com. That's Barnett with 2 T's. Thank you, Thomas Barnett, and keep up your work.